There are some truths you don't discover. They discover you, and once they find you, you can never go back. In the winter of 1879, workmen pried open the rotting floorboards of the Sunset Years Christian Home in Hartford, Connecticut, and unleashed something no prayer could cleanse. Beneath those boards, swaddled in burial shrouds mottled with time, they found 23 leather-bound ledgers. Each one was swollen with age, every page bloated with ink and numbers. Names, dates, methods, amounts. They weren't medical logs. They were death manifests. What the world would later learn, though not all of it, is that these books documented 189 deliberate murders. Elderly men and women, poisoned in silence, their fortunes harvested with surgical precision. The killers weren't vagrants, nor back-alley butchers. They were the people entrusted to protect the weak. Dr. William Porter, his wife, Margaret, and her sister, Sarah. For 34 years, they cloaked themselves in scripture and charity, the perfect guardians of the frail and forgotten. In reality, they were running one of the most profitable killing enterprises in American history. The full truth never made the papers. Couldn't. If the public had known what Hartford authorities buried, the faith in Christian charity itself might have collapsed overnight. And so, for nearly a century, the official story was that the Sunset Years Christian Home simply closed its doors. But you're here now, and I'm going to show you what they tried to erase. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to strip away the illusions you've been fed since you were a child, the ones that tell you evil looks obvious, that it wears a villain's mask. No, the worst evil wears a smile, folds its hands in prayer, and calls itself good. The Porters were masters of the perfect crime. Select the wealthy, the isolated, the easily erased. Then administer death so slowly, so gently, that even the victim believed they were simply slipping away. All while their caretakers whispered promises of heaven. Tonight, we go deeper than the headlines, deeper than the dusty archive files. Tonight, you will understand how 3 people built an empire of death under the banner of Christian mercy, and how the systems that should have stopped them protected them instead. Hartford, 1845. A city caught between two worlds, the rigid morality of its Puritan ancestors and the glinting temptation of industrial wealth. The streets smelled of coal and ambition. Factories churned. Ships unloaded fortunes along the Connecticut River. And in the drawing rooms of Hartford's merchant elite, a silent problem was growing. The elderly. Not just any elderly, wealthy elderly. Widows with shipping fortunes, retired bankers, merchants whose children had fled west chasing gold and land, leaving them alone with estates worth more than some towns. They had no one to guard them, except the institutions that claimed to be rooted in God. Into that vacuum stepped Dr. William Porter. He was tall, silver-haired, and disturbingly perfect. A Yale-trained physician, a Mexican-American war field surgeon, a man who spoke with the cadence of a preacher and the precision of a surgeon. His wife, Margaret, a trained nurse from Boston's charity hospitals, had the soft voice and careful hands of a woman people trusted instantly. And then there was Sarah, Margaret's sister, quiet, observant, with the gift of making you confess things you didn't intend to share. Together, they purchased a sprawling Victorian mansion on Prospect Avenue. 3 stories, 2 acres of gardens, a private chapel with sunlight spilling through stained glass. They called it the Sunset Years Christian Home. The promise was irresistible. A sanctuary for the elderly wealthy, where prayer and medicine worked hand in hand to prepare the soul for eternity. They charged $200 a month, a sum beyond the reach of most families. But for Hartford's elite, it was not just affordable. It was respectable. To send your aging parent, there was a statement. We spared no expense for their comfort, and we entrusted them to God's care. What no one saw was that the Porters had already built the bones of a machine designed not to extend life, but to harvest death. They had studied the legal loopholes. They had tested the public's faith in Christian charity. And they knew that if they wore the right mask, the community would defend them against any accusation. In their ledgers, later found under those floorboards, the first entry begins here. Before the first victim, before the first will was forged. William's handwriting is steady, deliberate. Begin operations. Selection process, Wealth, isolation, absence of heirs. Duration of stay ideally under 6 months. Method to be tested. The Sunset Years Christian Home had opened its doors. Now all that remained was to wait for the right soul to step through them. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb, 68 years old, widow of a textile magnate. Estate valued at $1.2 million in 1870s money. No children, no living siblings. Her only relatives were distant cousins scattered across New York and Massachusetts, none close enough to interfere. She arrived at the Sunset Years Christian Home on a carriage drawn by 2 white horses, her luggage monogrammed, her demeanor sharp and skeptical. She didn't come seeking prayer. She came because the mansion's advertisements promised complete convalescence for ladies and gentlemen of refinement. And Dr. Porter, with his grave sincerity and immaculate manners, convinced her that here she would not be left to fade alone. For the first 2 weeks, Eleanor flourished. The food was rich, the gardens immaculate. Margaret personally attended her daily walks. Sarah read to her in the evenings. Her strength returned. She began to speak of selling her Boston townhouse and making Hartford her permanent home. That's when the Porters began phase 1, dependency. They removed her small freedoms, piece by piece, under the guise of medical necessity. A hand on her elbow when she walked. A gentle insistence that she rest more. New medications just to help you sleep. The first dose was harmless. The second, less so. The third made her too drowsy to leave her room. Soon she could no longer track the days. Her memory began to fail. While Eleanor drifted in and out of lucidity, Sarah visited her with pen and paper, gently suggesting she review her affairs for peace of mind. The new will was short, almost elegant in its efficiency, naming the Sunset Years Christian Home as sole beneficiary. By the 3rd month, Eleanor no longer recognized her own reflection. Dr. Porter's tonics kept her calm. Her appetite vanished. On a rain-heavy night in November, Eleanor Whitcomb passed quietly in her bed, rosary in hand. Her obituary described her death as peaceful and blessed. The Hartford Courant praised the Porters for their tireless service to the fading members of our community. The mansion's bank account swelled by $320,000 in cash, bonds, and property deeds. And in the first of those hidden ledgers, William Porter inked a simple notation beside her name. Success. Method 3 confirmed. The Porters didn't think of their killings as murders. They thought of them as procedures. Each one had a purpose. Each one was tested, refined, and catalogued with the same clinical detachment as a surgeon perfecting a new operation. Inside the ledgers, their language was cold, stripped of humanity. Victims were never patients, they were subjects. The method of death was never poison, it was application. And each application had a code. Method 1, the taper. A slow withdrawal of stimulants and nutrients under the guise of rest therapy. The subject grew weaker over months until the body simply stopped. No suspicion, but risked losing inheritance to natural decline before wills could be altered. Method 2, the gilded sleep. Incremental doses of laudanum dissolved in sherry, escalating to lethal levels over weeks. Perfect for subjects already on sedatives. Easiest to pass off as respiratory failure. Method 3, the angel's breath. An undetectable combination of morphine and belladonna, given only at night, worked within weeks, preserving appearance and minimizing signs of distress. This was the one used on Eleanor Whitcomb, quick enough for profit, slow enough for plausible piety. Method 4, the pilgrim's decline. Applied to subjects with active diseases. The Porters would deliberately suppress treatment while administering supportive care, accelerating the inevitable. No poison required, just the careful denial of life-saving intervention. Each method had its own refinements, down to the hour of dosing, the type of drink used to mask taste, even the prayers recited at bedside to soothe the subject's suspicion. Sarah's role was infiltration. Margaret's was administration. William's was calibration, adjusting the dosage, observing physical decline, and timing death to coincide with legal readiness. Over the first 5 years, the ledgers recorded 27 subjects, each death tagged with a method number and an efficiency score. The profit margins written in the same tidy script were obscene. By 1850, they were no longer just caretakers. They were engineers of death, their mansion nothing more than an assembly line disguised as a sanctuary. And as word spread of the sunset years' Christian homes, unmatched compassion. The waiting list grew. It happened in the spring of 1851. Subject number 28. Reverend Thomas Galloway was a wealthy retired minister, beloved in Hartford for his fiery sermons and charitable works. Unlike most of the porter's clients, he was still sharp, still mobile, and still deeply connected to the city's religious circles. He'd come to the Sunset Years Christian home for rest after a minor stroke, but within a month, William Porter began method 2, the Gilded Sleep. Laudanum in the Reverend's evening port, the dosage increased every week. What William didn't anticipate was Galloway's old friend, Dr. Amos Lindley, a visiting physician with a reputation for suspicion. Lindley noticed the Reverend's sudden slurred speech, the glassy eyes, the slowed pulse. He asked for a list of medications. Margaret handed him a neatly written sheet omitting, of course, the laudanum. Lindley wasn't convinced. He insisted on staying the night. That evening, he caught Sarah bringing the Reverend a cup of port. He demanded to taste it and stopped cold after the first sip. "This is medicated," he said. "He's being sedated without cause." In that moment, the entire machine teetered. If Lindley pressed the matter, the Sunset Years could collapse. William didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply leaned in and whispered something only Lindley heard. The doctor's face went pale. He handed the cup back, left without another word, and never returned. The ledgers give no hint of what William said, only a notation in the margin. Lindley neutralized. Leverage established. Referrals to follow. 2 weeks later, Galloway died peacefully in his sleep. At the funeral, Dr. Lindley delivered the eulogy praising the Porters for their devotion to the Reverend's comfort. Within a month, 3 new residents arrived at the mansion. All 3 were Lindley's own patients. The Lindley incident taught the Porters something invaluable. You didn't need to silence a threat with violence. You could turn it into an asset. From then on, they began keeping what William called the second ledger. This one was smaller, bound in black leather, and hidden separately from the death records. It contained no names of victims, only the names of the living, each paired with a single word: debt, scandal, vice, illegitimacy, fraud. Margaret called it the garden. "We water them," she told Sarah one night, "and they bloom for us when we need them." The pattern was simple. 1. A doctor, banker, or clergyman would get too curious. 2. Sarah would listen quietly until she found the thread: a gambling habit, an affair, a missing sum from church funds. 3. William would accidentally let them discover something troubling in the home enough to put them on edge. 4. Then came the conversation in which the troubling thing was acknowledged, and the personal secret was named. In that moment, fear became loyalty. Those who bent became referral partners. Those who hesitated were offered a share of the harvest, a discrete percentage of each inheritance that came through their hands. By 1853, the Porters no longer relied solely on their own advertising. Wealthy, isolated elders were now delivered to their door by doctors, lawyers, and pastors who owed them silence. The second ledger shows that in a single year, 22% of the mansion's profits went to partnership incentives. The rest, pure gain. And with every new name in the Black Book, the Porters' power in Hartford grew until even the city's most righteous men owed them something they couldn't afford to see exposed. The first crack came in the summer of 1854. Subject number 41. Mrs. Abigail Pierce was a wealthy widow from Providence, Rhode Island. She had no children, but she did have a niece, Clara Pierce, a schoolteacher in Boston. Clara was quiet by nature, not one to pry, but she adored her aunt, and when Abigail's letters abruptly stopped after moving into the Sunset Years Christian home, Clara grew uneasy. Margaret explained in polite, flowing handwriting that Mrs. Pierce's health had taken a regrettable turn, and she was too tired for correspondence. She enclosed a pressed rose from the mansion's gardens, the scent faintly sweet. But Clara wasn't satisfied. She arrived without warning one Saturday afternoon, stepping off the carriage in a plain gray dress, small leather satchel in hand. Her presence alone disrupted the mansion's carefully staged serenity. William greeted her in the parlor, all warmth and concern. Abigail, he explained, was resting after a fainting spell, but of course you may see her. Clara followed him up the wide staircase. When she entered her aunt's room, the sight nearly froze her. Abigail sat propped against pillows, skin pale, eyes glassy, speaking in disjointed fragments. Clara took her hand. It was cool, limp. "Auntie, what have they given you?" Abigail tried to answer, but the words dissolved into a slur. Clara stayed by her bedside for hours, refusing William's offers of tea, refusing Margaret's suggestion to rest in the guest suite. When night fell, she returned to Boston, but not before quietly taking a lock of her aunt's hair and slipping it into her satchel. The ledgers note it in William's hand. Clara Pierce intrusive. Departure suspicious. Monitor. A week later, a letter arrived from Clara addressed to the Hartford City Medical Examiner, requesting a formal investigation into the health of Mrs. Abigail Pierce. The Porters now had a problem they'd never faced before: someone with no leverage in the second ledger, no appetite for bribes, and enough resolve to bring outside eyes into their operation. William's first instinct was elimination, a quick pivot to Method 3 on Abigail, before any official could arrive. Margaret, however, saw a different path. "Clara's a schoolteacher," she said. "Teachers believe in explanations. Give her one so tidy, so reasonable, that she'll carry it back to Boston and defend us herself." The next morning, Sarah sent a telegram to Clara. "Your aunt greatly improved. Stop. Would be delighted for you to visit again. Stop. Bring your trusted physician." Clara arrived 3 days later, this time with Dr. Josiah Reed, a kindly Boston physician in a long brown coat. Reed was given full access to Abigail, but Abigail was not the woman Clara had seen a week earlier. She was sitting up in bed, smiling faintly, her hair brushed, her cheeks touched with a warm flush. A fresh bouquet of lilacs stood on the bedside table. "The faintness you saw," Margaret explained sweetly, "was due to a reaction from a tonic one given in error by a newly hired nurse, now dismissed. Since then, we have returned to a simpler regimen, and you can see the improvement." Reed examined Abigail, asked her a few questions, and nodded approvingly. "She's frail, yes, but I see no cause for alarm." Margaret had staged the recovery with precise care. For 3 days before Clara's arrival, Abigail's laudanum doses had been reduced to almost nothing, replaced with sugared tea and mild stimulants. Her mind had cleared just enough to pass Reed's inspection. Clara left Hartford reassured, even embarrassed for suspecting foul play. But the second ledger gained a new entry under Reed's name: Boston, reputation vulnerable, debt possible. Within a year, Reed had referred 2 wealthy patients to the Sunset Years Christian Home. Clara never wrote another letter of concern. It was bound to happen eventually. Someone inside the Sunset Years Christian Home, who was not yet too far gone to notice the pattern. Subject number 53. Mr. Elias Rourke was a retired shipping magnate from New Haven. 72, rail-thin, still sharp-eyed. He had survived yellow fever in Havana, bankruptcy in 34, and 2 bouts of pneumonia. Rourke had made a career of reading men's intentions like ledgers, and the Porter's smiles didn't fool him for long. In his second week, he began to take note. The same restorative port served to certain residents each night, never to him. How those residents' steps slowed within days. How their wills, once finalized, disappeared into Margaret's private study. By the 3rd month, 3 residents he dined with were gone. Their rooms were cleaned within hours, possessions discreetly packed away. One evening, William brought Rourke a small crystal glass of the restorative port. Rourke smiled, thanked him, and set it aside. Later, when Sarah came to collect it, she found the liquid untouched. "Not to your taste?" she asked lightly. "I prefer my wine without additives," he replied. His tone was polite, but his eyes held a quiet challenge. That night, Rourke wrote a letter not to family, he had none living, but to an associate in New York, Samuel Cutter, a lawyer who owed him favors from the shipping days. The letter was brief, almost cryptic. If anything happens to me here, the reasons are not natural. Cutter, remember the Stuyvesant affair. He sealed it, addressed it, and paid a messenger boy from his own coin to see it posted at dawn. William intercepted the boy at the gate. The letter never reached New York. In the margin of that day's ledger, Rourke aware, delay action, determine knowledge depth. For the first time, the porters faced a resident who might not be easily silenced and whose downfall would require a different sort of engineering. Eliminating Rourke outright was too risky. A sudden illness after his open suspicion could stir unease among the other residents and worse, tempt them to whisper. Margaret's solution was quieter. Isolate him without seeming to. She began by reassigning his dining arrangements. No longer was he seated among the talkative few in the east dining room. Instead, he was moved to the smaller west parlor table for better sunlight, alongside two nearly deaf widows who could not follow a conversation. His afternoon walks were curtailed by Sarah, citing icy paths and doctor's orders. Instead, a young attendant named Thomas shadowed him indoors, steering him toward reading rooms and away from doorways that led outside. The library, his refuge, had its hours shortened for cataloging. Even his letters were quietly delayed, sometimes returned with notes about postage errors or misaddressed envelopes. Meanwhile, a different kind of poison was at work. Reputation. William confided in select residents, lowering his voice just enough, that poor Mr. Rourke had begun suffering a touch of confusion. Nothing serious, but enough to make him anxious. Within a week, smiles toward Rourke were tinged with pity. Conversations ceased when he entered the room. Alone, with no allies and every small frustration amplified, Rourke's temper began to fray. He snapped at Thomas, refused Margaret's polite inquiries, and once, in the hallway, shouted after William, accusing him of theft. The outburst sealed his fate. Margaret summoned Dr. Whitford, one of the home's oldest referral partners. In his report, Whitford wrote that Rourke's mental state had declined to the point of dangerous paranoia and recommended compassionate seclusion. That night, Rourke was moved to the attic suite, a small, drafty space meant for contagious patients where meals were brought on a tray and conversation was reduced to curt exchanges. 2 months later, he was gone. The cause listed in the official record: complications from pneumonia. The ledger notes were simpler: resolved without incident. Absolutely. Here is section 11, and I will continue through to section 33 in sequence, each section tight, dark, cinematic, and deepening the descent. By 1857, the Sunset Years Christian home was no longer just a mansion on Prospect Avenue, it was a blueprint for a far darker empire. The Porters acquired the Havenbrook estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Hartford, cloaked in ancient oaks and shadowed by stone walls. Where the Sunset Years mansion had been a facade of Victorian gentility, Havenbrook was designed for scale: more rooms, more patience, more wealth to be siphoned. The move was bold. It required enormous capital, political favors, and an ironclad silence among Hartford's elite. Sarah orchestrated the legal end, weaving ownership through trusts and silent partnerships, ensuring the Porters' hands remained unseen. Margaret expanded her nursing staff, recruiting carefully vetted aides bound by secrecy oaths. William began training new doctors in the Porter protocols, a cold, precise curriculum of murder disguised as medicine. At Havenbrook, the methods evolved. Poisonings were supplemented by gas chambers masquerading as sanctuaries for rest, slow starvation, hidden behind layers of false nutrition charts. The psychological control systems grew tighter. Music, prayer, and ritual became tools of sedation as much as faith. The scale was terrifying. By the end of the decade, the Porters were overseeing nearly 120 deaths a year across both locations. And with each death, a portion of wealth, influence, and silence poured into their coffers. But with expansion came risk and a new kind of enemy: the press. Rumors began trickling into Hartford newspapers, vague hints of disappearances, of families denied access, of strange odors from the estate at night. William and Sarah answered with calculated generosity, sponsoring charity balls, printing glowing testimonials and burying rumors beneath layers of influence. The porters weren't just murderers. They were masters of narrative. The public saw charity. They felt hope. Few saw the darkness beneath the veneer. By 1860, Havenbrook had become the porter's crown jewel, a place where the machinery of death was both art and science. But no empire is built without cracks. And the first fissure appeared in the shape of a persistent journalist named Elias Cartwright. Cartwright was a man obsessed with the shadows lurking behind Hartford's polished society. His articles, published anonymously at first, hinted at strange disappearances and unanswered questions about the Sunset Year's home. He described whispered rumors of merciful deaths that felt anything but. The porters knew him by reputation long before they met. Sarah saw in Cartwright a dangerous spark, one that could ignite public outrage and unravel decades of careful concealment. Instead of striking him down, they extended an invitation and offer to tour Havenbrook under strict conditions. The goal wasn't to convince Cartwright of their innocence, no. They wanted to watch him, to learn his methods, and most importantly, to trap him in their web. Over days, Cartwright was led through pristine halls, introduced to seemingly content residents, and shown elaborate records of medical care. The porter's charm was a weapon honed to perfection. But beneath the surface, they whispered instructions to staff, every glance monitored, every word recorded. Cartwright left with his notebook full, but his writing slowed and softened over the following months. A subtle fear had taken root. The ledger's margin noted simply, Cartwright contained, influence neutralized. It was the first public threat, and the porters had met it with chilling precision, turning investigation into control. Cartwright's containment was a warning to anyone who dared pry too deeply. But as the 1860s marched on, the porters found new ways to tighten their grip, especially through the invisible chains of psychological control. William, ever the scientist, had begun experimenting with ritualized compliance. He understood that true power didn't just come from fear, it came from conditioning minds to accept their own subjugation as salvation. Every morning, residents were gathered in the chapel for a ceremony that blurred prayer with subtle suggestion. The sermons, carefully crafted by Sarah and whispered through hired clergy, framed suffering as divine mercy and obedience as the path to eternal peace. Margaret introduced a regimen of controlled sensory input, soft hymns, subdued lighting, and repetitive routines designed to dull resistance. The staff, trained to smile and soothe, became agents of submission rather than care. The residents, isolated from family and exposed only to this controlled environment, began to lose not just their physical strength but their will to question. They became willing participants in their own demise. William documented the effects meticulously. Subject compliance increased 37% after ritual introduction. Resistance fractures observable within 3 weeks. Mental clarity sacrificed for peace. A necessary exchange. This psychological enslavement was the true weapon of the porter's reign, far more dangerous than poison or forged wills. It was a slow erasure of self, a final conquest hidden behind prayers and piety. And it was unstoppable. But every empire of shadows needs collaborators, and the porters built theirs from the city's pillars: lawyers, doctors, clergy, and politicians, all woven into their web. Sarah's mastery was in creating layers of legitimacy. She cultivated friendships with Hartford's most respected attorneys, feeding them generous fees and fabricated documents that disguised the home's sinister purpose. These lawyers became gatekeepers, quietly dismissing any estate disputes and ensuring wills passed smoothly into the porters' hands. Their loyalty wasn't born from devotion to the porters, it was fear of exposure, or the promise of silent payment. Reverend Samuel Whitmore, once an outspoken advocate, was turned by carefully timed donations to his church and the quiet threat of scandal involving his parishioners. He became an unwitting mouthpiece, preaching sermons that reinforced the sanctity of the home and its caretakers. Local politicians received discreet campaign contributions, ensuring the city's authorities looked the other way during sporadic inspections or rumors. William referred to this network as the Covenant, a pact of silence sealed by mutual benefit and mutual destruction. The porters were no longer just murderers hiding in plain sight, they were puppet masters, pulling strings behind the curtain of Hartford's elite society. and anyone who threatened the covenant faced ruin worse than death. By 1865, the Porter Empire was a fortress built on deception and blood. But the darkest chapter was yet to unfold, one that would challenge even their coldest calculations. Enter Evelyn Marlowe, a fiercely independent woman in her early 60s, newly admitted to Havenbrook under the guise of seeking peace in her final days. But Evelyn was no ordinary resident. A former abolitionist and writer, she carried scars not only of age but of a life spent fighting systems of control and corruption. Her mind was sharp, her suspicions immediate. Unlike others, Evelyn questioned the routine, the endless prayers, the silences, the strange illnesses that seemed to strike without warning. She made quiet notes, memorized staff shifts, and observed the subtle power plays that others missed. Her presence unsettled the Porters. Margaret sensed the threat quickly and instructed staff to be especially gentle, to keep Evelyn isolated with books and distractions. William contemplated more direct methods, but Sarah hesitated. Evelyn's connections ran deep. She had friends in powerful circles outside Hartford. They needed a plan. They began a campaign of slow erosion, encouraging doubt among Evelyn's few allies, planting seeds of mistrust, and casting shadows on her reputation. They hoped time would wear her down, turn her sharp edges blunt. But Evelyn's resistance became a beacon for others, a spark in a room of dying embers. The ledgers marked a new tone. Marlowe uncontrollable, variable. Strategy shift required. This was no longer just about money or silence, it was about preserving the empire at any cost. And Evelyn Marlowe was about to become the Porters' greatest challenge. The Porters had faced many threats, but Evelyn was something different, a storm no protocol could easily contain. Margaret escalated her tactics, shifting from subtlety to calculated aggression. Evelyn's medications were adjusted, small doses of opiates, masked by claims of restlessness and anxiety. But Evelyn resisted the fog that was meant to dull her mind. She fought through the haze, keeping her thoughts razor-sharp. William took a more insidious approach, arranging late-night visits by comfort staff, who doubled as psychological operatives. They whispered soothing lies, questioned Evelyn's memory, and sowed doubt about her own sanity. Sarah tightened the legal noose, manipulating documents to isolate Evelyn from potential allies, casting her as an unstable nuisance unworthy of trust. But Evelyn had allies' letters smuggled out in the hands of discreet visitors, cryptic warnings sent to the press and friends in nearby towns. The Porters' walls were beginning to tremble. In response, they convened a secret meeting in the mansion's basement, a cold chamber lined with iron and shadows where they planned their final gambit. The ledgers recorded the chilling conclusion. Operation Eclipse. Neutralize Marlowe. No witnesses. This was the moment the Porters crossed from murder cloaked in mercy to outright elimination of a threat that could expose them all. Evelyn's fight was now a matter of life or death for her and for the Dark Empire itself. Operation Eclipse was swift and merciless, a darkness engineered with precision. One cold November evening, Evelyn was found in her room, her breath shallow, eyes glazed over. The attending nurse claimed it was a sudden stroke, a cruel twist of fate. Margaret had administered a cocktail of morphine and a new compound, one that William had been testing in secret, a drug designed to mimic natural causes but induce rapid decline. The official death certificate stated, cerebral hemorrhage. No autopsy was performed. The staff spoke in hushed tones of a peaceful passing, a merciful release from suffering. But in the ledger, William's handwriting was clinical and cold. Subject terminated without incident. Operation successful. Public narrative secured. Yet, Evelyn's final act was not silence. A hidden letter was discovered months later by a housekeeper, a note Evelyn had managed to write in the shadow of death. The light fades, but the truth remains. Beware the smiling saints and the holy liars. Though her voice was silenced, Evelyn Marlowe's spirit echoed a warning carved into the dark heart of the Porter Empire. And it was a warning that would haunt them in the years to come. Evelyn's death sent ripples through the fragile silence cloaking the Porter Empire, but outwardly, the world saw only a serene end to a dignified life. Behind closed doors, however, the Porters grew increasingly ruthless, aware that every new resident was a potential risk, every visitor a possible threat. They fortified Havenbrook with secret passages, surveillance disguised as servant routes, and rooms rigged to isolate the uncooperative. Staff underwent rigorous indoctrination, drilled to absolute loyalty. Failure meant disappearance, whispered among the few who dared speak. Yet cracks began to widen. Whispers of disappearances reached neighboring towns. Strange noises and flickering lights haunted the estate at night. Rumors bred fear, but also curiosity, and a growing number of those outside the porter's grasp began to ask questions. Hartford's authorities, long complicit or indifferent, found themselves pressured by citizens and some brave officials to investigate. But the porters, masters of manipulation, spun a web of lies and obfuscation. Each probe was met with rehearsed testimonies, doctored records, and carefully staged compassion. They had become not just killers, but architects of deception so intricate it blurred the line between truth and fiction. And the deeper one looked, the darker the shadows became. The growing scrutiny forced the porters to evolve their methods, shifting from overt control to an invisible suffocation of dissent. No longer did they rely solely on poison or forged documents. They mastered the art of erasure. Residents who posed even the slightest threat simply vanished, transferred to distant, unregistered facilities, or quietly locked away in rooms that no one ever entered. Letters sent by worried relatives were intercepted or destroyed. Visitors who asked too many questions were politely but firmly turned away. Within the estate, a culture of silence settled like a shroud. Staff who balked at orders disappeared without explanation, replaced by those who knew fear well. This was psychological warfare on a vast scale. Fear bred compliance, and compliance bred more fear. But fear alone could not protect the porters forever. In 1870, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a local schoolteacher named Amelia Hart, whose niece had disappeared after entering sunset years. Amelia began her own investigation, collecting fragments of stories, deciphering patterns in death certificates, and risking her own safety to gather evidence. She became the first flicker of resistance in a town long lulled into complacency. And for the porters, Amelia was a new kind of enemy, one who threatened to unravel everything with a relentless pursuit of truth. Amelia Hart was a woman possessed by a singular obsession to uncover what the porters had buried beneath decades of lies. Armed with nothing but courage and a growing pile of discrepancies, she began knocking on doors, questioning former staff, and piecing together the stories of those who had quietly vanished. Her inquiries were met with polite deflection at first. They moved away. Illness took them. It's best not to pry. But the deeper she dug, the more she rattled the brittle bones of a sinister secret. Letters she unearthed, hidden wills she discovered, and whispered confessions from frightened attendants painted a grim picture, one that the town's elite desperately wanted to ignore. The porters, sensing the rising tide of exposure, tightened their grip. Sarah personally oversaw legal barriers designed to silence Amelia, employing every trick of probate law to deny her access to crucial documents. William began using medical authority to brand Amelia's questions as baseless and her reputation as unstable, discrediting her in the eyes of the public. Margaret orchestrated a network of informants within the town, ensuring no move Amelia made went unnoticed. But Amelia pressed on, undeterred by the growing shadows closing in around her. In her relentless pursuit, she became a beacon of defiance, a threat that the porters would soon realize could unravel everything they had built. And for the first time, a real confrontation loomed on the horizon. The porters' empire was now under siege not by outsiders, but by the relentless flame of truth. Amelia's investigations sparked quiet unrest among Hartford's residents. Whispers turned into questions, questions into demands. Under immense pressure, the porters tightened their stranglehold, resorting to ever darker tactics. One stormy night, a prominent local who had expressed sympathy for Amelia disappeared without a trace, his empty home left in eerie silence. Rumors swirled of porters' agents lurking in shadows, ready to silence anyone who dared speak. Sarah, cold and calculating, orchestrated false leads to misdirect investigations, planting evidence to implicate rivals and distract the authorities. William, once a healer, now a puppet master of death, continued to perfect the art of silent murder, no longer just of the elderly, but of those who threatened to expose the truth. Margaret's once tender touch had hardened into ruthless efficiency, coordinating the staff with military precision. The porters were no longer merely caretakers, they were executioners of a kingdom built on lies. But the deeper the darkness, the closer the light fought to break through. Amelia's story was becoming impossible to ignore, and Hartford stood on the edge of reckoning. The tension in Hartford reached a boiling point in the summer of 1875. Amelia Hart, armed with enough evidence to shake the foundations of the city, called for a public meeting, an unprecedented move to expose the porters before the eyes of the community. The hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Families whose loved ones had vanished sat in stunned silence. Clergy who had once praised the porters now watched, uncertain and uneasy. Amelia spoke with relentless clarity, detailing the pattern of poisonings, forged wills, and the web of complicity that kept the Porter empire alive. She revealed letters smuggled from Havenbrook, eyewitness accounts from former staff, and even fragments from the hidden ledgers that William had tried so desperately to keep secret. The crowd's shock was palpable. Some gasped, others wept, and a few tried to dismiss her words as impossible. But the porters were not idle. From the shadows, they orchestrated a counterattack, a coordinated smear campaign to discredit Amelia and her supporters, accusing them of lies and slander. The local press, long influenced by the porters' wealth and power, wavered in their coverage. Some ran neutral stories, others attacked Amelia's credibility. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Hartford could no longer ignore the darkness that had festered within its walls. The stage was set for a brutal clash between a community awakening and an empire desperate to survive. The battle for Hartford's soul was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It had spilled into the streets, the courtrooms, the very hearts of its people. Amelia's calls for justice stirred a fragile awakening, but the porters unleashed their full arsenal of influence and terror. They bribed officials, corrupted jurors, and spread rumors that Amelia was mentally unstable, a desperate attempt to poison the well of public opinion. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Havenbrook, new victims arrived, quietly resigned to their fate, unaware that the very hands meant to care for them would end their lives with practiced cruelty. The porters escalated their methods, now blending poison with staged accidents, crafting deaths so seamless they left no trace of foul play. Their ledger entries grew colder, more mechanical, each death a transaction, each inheritance a prize to be claimed. Yet beneath the porters' calm surface, cracks began to widen. Staff grew nervous, some whispering about the growing risk, others succumbing to guilt. Small acts of rebellion flickered, misplaced keys, secret notes, subtle disruptions. But the porters crushed dissent swiftly and without mercy. The war for the truth was brutal, but the people of Hartford were beginning to see through the smoke and mirrors. And the fall of the Porter Empire was closer than anyone dared to imagine. The tipping point came unexpectedly, in the form of a young maid named Lydia Quinn. Quiet and observant, Lydia had worked at Havenbrook for years, her eyes carrying the weight of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. One night, driven by a mixture of fear and desperate hope, she slipped a hidden ledger out of the porter's private study and fled the estate under cover of darkness. This ledger wasn't like the others. It contained the most damning evidence yet. Names, dates, precise accounts of poisonings, forged wills, and, chillingly, a list of co-conspirators within the city's elite. Lydia's courage shattered the veil. She handed the ledger to Amelia Hart, who recognized it as the key to unraveling decades of deceit. Together, they prepared to expose the porters to the full glare of public scrutiny. The reaction was immediate and violent. The porters retaliated with all their might, unleashing threats, bribes, and intimidation aimed at silencing Lydia and Amelia. But the truth, once unearthed, could not be buried again. The ledger ignited investigations, arrests, and public outrage, the beginning of the long, painful unraveling of the Porter Empire. It was a moment that changed everything, a moment when the shadows began to bleed into light. The city's response was chaotic and explosive. Newspapers that once whispered the porter's praises now screamed accusations across their pages. Public opinion, long manipulated and suppressed, erupted into fury. Families demanded answers. The courts, pressured by the weight of evidence, began unprecedented investigations. But the Porters were far from defeated. Sarah's legal expertise transformed into a fortress of delay tactics and loopholes, buying precious time as the family scrambled to maintain control. William's medical knowledge was weaponized to sow doubt. Expert witnesses claimed natural causes for deaths, dismissing evidence of foul play as conspiracy. Margaret coordinated public relations campaigns, portraying the family as victims of slander and hysteria. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks deepened. Allies turned uncertain. The once impenetrable covenant began to fracture. Whispers of betrayal and fear spread through Hertford's elite, some quietly abandoning their ties to the Porters to save themselves. It was a battle not just for justice but for survival. And the endgame was closing in. As the courtroom battles raged, the Porters' fortress of deceit began to crumble piece by piece. Testimonies from former staff, once silenced by fear, now echoed with chilling clarity, describing the systematic poisonings, the forged documents, the rituals of control. Amelia Hart emerged not just as a witness but as the symbol of a city's painful awakening. Yet the Porters refused to fall quietly. William, once a respected doctor, used every legal and medical tactic to evade responsibility, twisting facts, confusing jurors, and exploiting loopholes. Sarah's relentless legal maneuvers delayed verdicts and confused the truth, buying time for desperate schemes. Margaret's public displays of grief, rehearsed to perfection, sought to sway public sympathy and stall justice. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hidden ledgers, letters, witness accounts, and the courage of survivors painted a picture too damning to deny. The city that had once been silent now demanded reckoning. The Porters' empire was collapsing, and with it, a darkness that had thrived for decades was finally exposed to the unforgiving light. The trial became a spectacle: packed courtrooms, flashing headlines, a city grappling with betrayal at its core. Survivors' voices broke decades of silence, their testimonies raw and harrowing, exposing the cold cruelty masked by Christian charity. William's once piercing blue eyes, now clouded with desperation, darted nervously as witnesses recounted the horrors hidden behind Havenbrook's walls. Sarah's calculated calm cracked under the relentless pressure, her legal defenses unraveling as the truth flooded the courtroom. Margaret's composed facade faltered during moments of intense cross-examination, revealing glimpses of the ruthlessness beneath. The jury, and the city beyond, faced an undeniable reckoning. This was not just a family's crime, but a systemic rot corroding the foundations of trust, faith, and justice. The verdict was more than a legal sentence. It was a symbolic judgment on a society that had looked away for too long. The Porter family's reign of terror was over, but the scars they left would haunt Hertford forever. The convictions came swiftly, and with them, a wave of relief and disbelief rippled through Hertford. William Porter was sentenced to life imprisonment, his medical license revoked and his reputation destroyed beyond repair. Sarah and Margaret faced long terms for their roles, stripped of all social standing and privileges they had amassed. Yet even as justice was served, a profound question lingered: how had such darkness flourished unnoticed for so long? The city began a painful reckoning with its own complicity, how fear, greed, and blind faith had enabled evil to wear a cloak of piety. Reform movements surged, demanding transparency in elder care and oversight of charitable institutions. But the legacy of the Porter family was more than policy. It was a stark warning about the price of silence and the power of hidden agendas. The shadows they cast stretched far beyond the walls of Havenbrook, infiltrating minds, institutions, and the very soul of a community. And their story serves as a chilling reminder that true evil often wears the guise of righteousness. The aftershocks of the Porter scandal rippled beyond Hertford, igniting debates across states about the vulnerability of the elderly and the unchecked power of institutions cloaked in faith. Investigations uncovered similar patterns in other Christian homes: hidden poisonings, forged wills, silent disappearances, a network of corruption far larger than anyone had imagined. The veil of sanctity that once protected such places was irrevocably torn. But even as laws changed and watchdogs multiplied, a deeper truth emerged. Evil is not confined to places or people, but to systems built on unquestioned authority and obedience. The Porter family's crimes were symptoms of a wider sickness, a culture that prized control over compassion, profit over protection, and appearances over truth. And the question remains, how many other shadows lurk in plain sight, masked by the very institutions we trust? This is the dangerous knowledge few dare confront, but every man seeking mastery over himself and his world must face it. For awareness is the first step toward reclaiming power from those who manipulate and deceive. The Porter legacy is a warning and a call to vigilance. The story of the Porters is not just history, it is a mirror reflecting a timeless struggle between light and darkness, truth and deception, power and submission. Men who seek to rise beyond the shadows must understand how manipulation operates beneath the surface, how trust can be weaponized, how institutions can become prisons disguised as sanctuaries. The Porters wielded religion as a tool of control, crafting a narrative of mercy while delivering death. They thrived because no one dared to question the facade. This is why your awareness matters: the courage to look deeper, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to refuse blind obedience. Every secret uncovered chips away at the foundations of oppression. And every man who claims his truth becomes a beacon for others lost in the darkness. The descent into the forbidden is not for the faint of heart, but it is the path to true mastery. Now, repeat this phrase twice in the comments. I claim my power in the shadow's light. Say it, own it, let it anchor your transformation as we continue this journey. You've taken the first steps beyond the veil, the moment when ignorance shatters and awareness sharpens into clarity. But the path forward is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth where every truth uncovered leads to deeper questions and darker corridors. The Porter family's story is one chapter in an endless battle, a war fought in silence by those who control history, manipulate minds, and rewrite reality. Institutions built to protect can be twisted into instruments of control. Faith can be weaponized to silence and subjugate. The very systems we trust are often the greatest sources of our bondage. To break free, a man must become his own authority, question, challenge, and dismantle the illusions that bind him. This requires strength not just of body, but of mind and spirit, a willingness to walk alone in the dark, guided only by the flicker of truth. And as you walk, remember, the deeper the darkness, the brighter your light must burn. The Porter family's saga is a brutal lesson on the cost of complacency and the price of turning a blind eye to corruption cloaked in sanctity. But it's also a call to arms for those who refuse to be controlled by fear, ignorance, or blind trust. True power comes from seeing the machinery behind the curtain, from understanding the forces that manipulate belief and obedience. This knowledge is dangerous, but it is the weapon you need to reclaim your sovereignty. The Porters built their empire on lies, but their legacy is your warning. The real enemy is the system that allows darkness to thrive beneath the guise of righteousness. It is a system fueled by fear and silence, broken only when men like you decide to confront it head-on. Stand vigilant, for the battles ahead will test every ounce of your courage. But know this, once you embrace the truth, you can never go back to ignorance. Now, as we reach the end of this dark descent, remember, this is not just a story of a family's evil, it's a blueprint for awakening. The shadows cast by the Porters stretch far beyond their time, woven into the fabric of institutions, faith, and power structures that persist today. The real horror is not just what they did, but how easily society allowed it to happen, how fear, greed, and blind trust became chains. But you have the choice to break those chains, to rise beyond manipulation, to see through the lies, to become the master of your own mind and destiny. This knowledge is a weapon and a responsibility. Guard it fiercely, share it wisely, and never forget the darkest truths often hold the brightest keys to freedom. You have been initiated into a brotherhood of awareness, a legacy of men who refuse to be controlled. The journey continues beyond this video. Stay vigilant, stay powerful, and remember, true mastery begins where most men choose to look away. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're part of a select brotherhood awakened to truths few dare to face. Now it's your turn to take action. Comment below with the phrase, "I claim my power in the shadow's light" twice. This isn't just words, it's your commitment to owning your awareness, standing against manipulation, and mastering your destiny. Share this video with a brother who needs to see beyond the veil. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this journey into the hidden, the forbidden, and the powerful is just beginning. Stay sharp, stay relentless, stay free.